Just in time for the World Baseball Classic, York Space Systems has acquired electrical propulsion company Orbium a mere 2 months after we called our shot. The move solidifies and secures York's technology stack from some of their closer competitors and has been in the works since before York's IPO was announced.
Get ready to show me the sat facts, as Lux Aeterna has announced a $10 million seed round of funding focused on enabling and providing reusable satellites and building the first step in the used car market for space assets.
For an underperforming company, Mynaric keeps showing up big. After Rheinmetall pulled their bid for the optical terminal company, they went on to win a contract to supply the laser communication terminals for a Hydron's demonstration system. If Rocket Lab's acquisition takes any longer, Mynaric will wind up acquiring them.
Welcome to this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Harrison Lambert,
Here with Cole Mayer.
excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Some extra exciting news for us is that we will be at SAT Show this next week, providing media coverage from March 22nd through 26th. SAT Show is a conference combining the satellite event with GovMill Space event to provide a gathering of industry and thought leadership around the space industry in general, with a focus on defense interests. If you plan to join us there, use discount code SPACE012. That's lowercase space 012 at checkout to save 20% on your ticket. Please reach out to us if you're interested in meeting at the event, and we look forward to seeing you there. For our main topics this week, we'll be covering optical comms, defense, and propulsion. To start off the optical comms topic, there's some big news coming out of Mynaric. Rheinmetall has announced that they've withdrawn their bid for Mynaric. We've been covering this for a couple months now, as Rocket Lab has been fiercely trying to acquire them for over a year. Germany kind of stepped in and has been blocking it on the basis of space sovereignty and trying to maintain a key technology that's critical to a lot of communications networks that are being stood up, and the increased efforts that Europe is making to have their own sovereign communications network. So Rheinmetall is a big defense contractor out of Germany. It made sense that they were trying to acquire Mynaric, as well as they have some contracts out to build more space communications, and it's kind of an expanding part of their business. But it looks like they've kind of stepped back from their competition with Rocket Lab over Mynaric. So it'll be interesting to see if another German competitor steps in to try to acquire Mynaric, or if Germany finally allows Rocket Lab to close out that acquisition.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how this sort of back and forth bidding process would work. I would imagine that Rocket Lab already sort of has an offer on the table and that they're not moving from that very much. But if there is much more of a sort of back and forth, it could be that, one of the other things that we're going to talk about this week is the fact that Mynaric keeps winning contracts. So Rocket Lab first started bidding for Mynaric over a year ago, when Mynaric was having a difficult time, when they hadn't won any contracts in a little while, and when they were more or less sort of underperforming. But the fact that Mynaric continues to win ESA support, continues to win these government contracts, indicates that they're starting to round the corner on one end or the other. So there could very well be reason to expect sort of the price point to be a little bit more fluid, that price point might be changing. And so maybe Rheinmetall was looking at things and figured, this price point is on its way up. It's raising. This is a little bit too expensive for us. There could be a multitude of different factors at play here, but interesting nonetheless. We'll have to see how this winds up shaking out, because I can only imagine that Rocket Lab wants to be done with this paperwork.
Yeah, and I feel like Germany's probably going to allow it at this point. Mynaric doesn't have too many contracts in the ESA. They have their optical terminals flying on the York space constellation. So there's a lot of connection they have to the American constellations, and that would benefit Rocket Lab to have that kind of aspect of that component. And Germany still has TSAT as one of their optical providers. So if they lose Mynaric, it's not like they fully lose this capability. TSAT's the optical provider for Kepler, which is a Canadian communications company that's been intertwining itself more with European interests with their Kongsberg Nano Avionics partnership they announced a few weeks ago. So I expect that to be a better fit for Germany to back one of their sovereign players for optical communications. And they just kind of let Mynaric go at this point.
Yeah, we've only seen Rheinmetall do absurdly large contracts, absurdly large deals. We've only seen Rheinmetall go after billions. I've not seen them go after something in the order of magnitude millions. So at the end of the day, this could have just been, effectively a favor that they did for somebody to take a look at Mynaric. But ultimately, the play, the market, everything that's going on, despite Mynaric starting to round the corner a little bit, it could all be just sort of too small for Rheinmetall to get really excited about.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if they choose kind of a different solution, because they are working on satellites like synthetic aperture radar that they partnered with ISI a few months ago. They're working on communications satellites as well, which are going to require this capability, at least to be competitive with current players. And Mynaric's been demonstrating a lot of capability for defense applications. Last week, they announced their ability to do quantum key encryption across their network, which is key for defense encryption services. And this week, they announced a new contract under the ESA to do laser communications demonstration system for Hydron, which is a high throughput optical network project. This project was previously awarded to them under level 2, and now they've won the contract for level 3. So really building upon that success, they're building out this capability for the ESA to develop their optical and quantum communications capabilities using this demonstration network. So they're going to deploy Mynaric across multiple orbits, test out different protocols, try to create more interoperability between different players, different constellations. This is a trend we've been seeing pick up more often as more of these constellations are deployed with more optical players entering the market. Having interoperability is really key for kind of scaling out to the sizes that people are talking about, hundreds, thousands of satellites. We saw it with Japan and the Hawkeye protocol about a couple months ago, and ESA is working on their eSTAL protocol, which is kind of the equivalent here. So a lot of standards plays going on here. I think this project will be key in actually testing out those protocols and optimizing them for everybody's benefit. So the growth here is not just amongst Europe and Canada and America. We're seeing it globally. China has their own endeavors to create their optical communications networks. Shanghai-based laser communications company Blue Star Optical Domain raised a $72 million Series C this last week. This money is going to be spent to localize the production of the components for their optical communications terminals and scale up their production to 1,000 units per year, which is a lot, but also seems kind of low given that the main consumer of this product will be the Huawei and the Thousand Sales projects in China, which are thousands, tens of thousands, large constellations of communications satellites, which, most satellites need 3 to 4 terminals each. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of terminals. If the production can only scale up to 1,000 units per year, I don't think they're going to take 100 years to do this. So I'd expect to see them raise again if they can get to that scaling within the year, or just continue scaling with the money they have. So if money comes in from these contracts under the Chinese government.
Yeah, I'd very much expect to see an additional raise come in at some point. Effectively, hey, this $72 million raise is for us to prove that we can achieve some level of manufacturing scale. And then once they prove out that they can do that, okay, great, you're able to get 1,000 per year. You're able to get 850 units per year. Great, we trust you that if we give you more money, you'll be able to get 5,000, 10,000 per year.
Yeah, and the other cool application for optical communications is optical to ground communication. So most of what we've been talking about has been space-to-space, non-terrestrial network use cases of optical communications, but increasingly we're seeing this expand to space-to-ground communications. There's been quite a few demonstrations across NASA, across China, to show that this is possible, but commercially it's pretty rare. Kepler is the first company that's been able to do it. They have their non-terrestrial optical communications, and then they augment that with a space-to-ground communications, which is actually unlocking some really neat capabilities, such as real-time streaming of data from hosted payloads such as Aurora Tech's fire monitoring imager and Axiom Space's data centers on board Kepler's first tranche of constellation launched a couple months ago. So Europe seems to be interested in building out its capability even further, as Swedish Space Corporation has inaugurated their optical ground station in Santiago, Chile. This is their second optical ground station, as they put one in Western Australia last year. So great to see that they're building upon that capability. It seems to signal that the one in Australia is doing well. And this plays under the ESA Nodes program, which is separate from that one that Mynaric's playing in. But all of these are kind of in the same optical and quantum communications capability that ESA is trying to build up over multiple programs under multiple partnerships. The optical communications terminals that Swedish Space Corporation is using are manufactured by Safran. So yet another sovereign player in this capability that Europe can draw against.
On the defense side of things, starting in Europe, so OHB, Airbus, and Rheinmetall all partnered in a bid for the Bundeswehr military communications constellation. It is a constellation proposed between 1 and 200 TACSATs, totaling roughly 10 billion euro in size. So you're looking at somewhere between neighborhood of 50 million to 100 million per satellite here. Just an absolutely massive contract, absolutely massive undertaking. And sort of to the point that I was making earlier, this is the type of big swing that we've seen and reported on with Rheinmetall previously. We haven't really seen them play in the order of magnitude of tens of millions or even hundreds of millions. So this is something much more in line with the sheer size and magnitude that we've seen these players go for previously. So OHB and Airbus. Airbus is based out of France, OHB based out of Germany. Yep. And then Rheinmetall, another German company as well. So interesting. I'm surprised that we're not seeing Thales or Leonardo trying to work in this communications constellation as well. But we'll probably see some similar or comparable investment focused on the more Italian primes in the coming months as well.
Yeah, I'm surprised that Rheinmetall doesn't try to get Mynaric for this constellation. The closest thing we've seen recently is Cesium Astro getting $500 million to build out their TACSAT capabilities for the U.S. But that's order of magnitude lower than this. Like closest thing would be Starshield out of the U.S. And both of those constellations plan to use optical terminals. It's a huge advantage for tactical satellite communications, especially in GPS denied environments or areas where radio frequencies are being jammed. So I'm really curious to see which optical terminal they end up choosing for this constellation. Airbus is a good partner for this, as they've already deployed the OneWeb constellation, so they have experience with these sort of constellations. Those have been used for tactical satellite communication applications as well. And the next generation of OneWeb is supposed to integrate optical communications terminals as well. So, this could have a parallel benefit to OneWeb as well as this partnership between OHB and Rheinmetall.
God, I hope they wind up going with Mynaric for the optical communications. That would be too funny.
I mean, they have Illyria in that Space RAN consortium that Airbus is part of. So that was my bet. Was that?
Oh, that's right.
Illyria, especially off that raise that Illyria did last week. That was pretty huge for them as well. So it would be funny if they give Mynaric over to the U.S. and then use a U.S. supplier for their own native constellation. Which would be really surprising given it's a defense application. I would have thought that, the sovereign implications here are much greater.
Yeah. Well, maybe that was part of the motivation behind Rheinmetall pulling their bid, was that this was sort of the use case that they thought maybe they would have for Mynaric, and then seeing that Illyria was the clear incumbent for that, maybe there's not as much of a point to this. So Beta Space's stratospheric balloon platforms partners with Airbus Geotech's expertise in data acquisition and intelligence from HAPS platforms. This collaboration between the two parties will unlock new capabilities for Earth observation, communications, security and defense applications, and environmental monitoring. And this is something that I found particularly interesting just because there is a market need and gap in Earth observation and intelligence gathering effectively. So the need is for effectively low-cost, always overhead solutions. High-resolution, low-cost, always overhead solutions. Now, you can get low-cost, that's LEO. LEO is not always overhead. LEO, you need a constellation of, I think, 16 satellites, something like that, in perfect orchestration to be able to always have some asset overhead, to be able to have that constant surveillance or observation, round the clock, quote unquote, intelligence. And in order to have one asset where you don't need to manage those ConOps nearly as much, it's a lower lift, lower maintenance priority. In order to have a geo asset, that's much higher in cost, but also the capabilities are much lower. So you're not able to get the high resolution that you need. So these sort of HAPS, high altitude platforms, are able to potentially provide a persistent, somebody who's overhead and is doing the work necessary to stay overhead despite sort of weather and wind changes, but able to stay in those high altitude areas, providing high resolution because they are at such low altitude, and persistent, always overhead surveillance and always overhead surveillance and intelligence updates. This is very much a current gap in sort of orbital solutions. So it'll be interesting to see how this partnership plays out.
Yeah, it's interesting trend because to me it seems really off and on. Like a couple weeks ago, we talked about Sky unveiling their solution, very similar solution. There was kind of a huge boom of them, like way back in November, and this company, Beta Space, has been around for like a dozen years. So it's not like it's new technology, but it almost to me seems like they're finding new applications for it in the kind of current paradigm of satellite constellations. And to me, it reads more like the benefit of satellite constellations, you can kind of have like this broad coverage of everything, but that persistency is kind of a key enabler of some applications. To me, particularly when you have a satellite that detects something in a large area, that could trigger a higher resolution, higher persistent platform to gather more data about it. It is cool that they're partnering with Airbus. I think that gives them a much stronger like defense foothold or more incumbent foothold. And to see if they end up using this for some of those commercial applications they're talking about, or more of the defense applications, kind of what I'm paying attention to. Because I think there's a lot of implications for defense, but they are more susceptible to attack since they're closer to the war zone or whatever area might be in conflict. Although as we're seeing, like space defense being a bigger thing, so maybe that differentiator is kind of going away, and there's some use coming back to having these platforms integrated into a complete system.
I agree with you. I think in large part, the sort of resurgence of HAPS solutions and the high altitude platform sort of segment, I think a big part of that resurgence is the fact that space itself is growing so rapidly and is suddenly becoming, I don't want to say militarized, but that the space domain is now so highly correlated with security needs that the sort of limitations of what space can provide are becoming a little bit more immediately and starkly apparent. And so like, oh, okay, great. We need to be able to do this. Yes, you can technically solve that with space. The price point for that solution would be, a number from a hat, would be 22 different satellites, all in constant communication. That's a $200 million contract up front, and then $20 million of maintenance and overhead that you need to maintain every year. Okay, great. What about a $150,000 asset with a $50,000 to $70,000 overhead? Okay, great. Sign me up. I think it's more so the fact that now that space is sort of growing so rapidly, and that its priority as a defense and security asset has been much more realized than it has over the past so many years. The gaps, limited and few that they are, stick out a little bit more. Closer to home, Anduril is looking to acquire space tracking firm Exo Analytics Solutions. The deal adds the ground-based telescope network and space surveillance data to the defense tech company's expanding space business. Now, I don't know whether it's still appropriate to consider Anduril to be a purely defense or purely terrestrial company at this point. They've stood up their space business back in 2024, and that has been a very clear priority for the company. But this acquisition of Exo Analytics Solution effectively doubles the personnel in their space team. And it indicates a really clear priority in Anduril's ability to vertically integrate the capabilities that they're trying to incorporate for their defense contracts.
Yeah, I think Anduril's kind of been off and on about space applications. I feel like they partner with space companies to have their kind of toe in that water. This is the clearest signal I've seen of them building out their own capability. And it's an interesting gap to fill because when Stargaze came online a couple of months ago, it was kind of a crisis for a lot of space defense awareness applications. But I think that people are quickly finding their foothold in this new kind of paradigm where Stargaze is meant to kind of track objects in space, but there's still a gap for more detail about each object that is being tracked. So we've seen it with like HEO has had a lot of great traction with actually imaging objects in space. I think Orbital has an interesting solution with their X-ray telescopes. Blue Ring from Blue Origin is still planned to do geo space monitoring, and there's a gap for tracking objects in geo as Stargaze does mostly LEO. So I think this capability is them kind of finding that there's still a gap in a hugely in demand market in the industry, which is space domain awareness. As space becomes more militarized, we need more awareness of what's in space. And I think back in November, Andrew had talked about some partnership around the time Lockheed talked about their orbital interceptor program. So Andrew is very interested in playing in the missile defense aspect, which they are kind of a missile strike capability company, but being more integrated into the broader missile defense ecosystem. So communications, tracking, potentially orbital interceptors down the line. I could see this as giving them a strong kind of connection with the U.S. government in this capability and expanding their core competency out from like ground attack capabilities to space attack as well.
I mean, ultimately, they're trying to win a larger share of the contracts that are going to be awarded for Golden Dome for the remainder of the proliferated warfighter network. And that's very much in line with what one would expect from Anduril moving forward.
So on the propulsion side of things, we've got a variety of news. Firefly Alpha has successfully returned to flight on their Flight 7 Stairway to 7 mission. This is great news for Firefly as they had to stand down launches after their failure on Flight 6 last year. This launch validates quite a few improvements that they've made since then, as well as delivering a Lockheed demo satellite to orbit, which is great news given that Flight 6 also tried to launch a Lockheed demo satellite. So there's still some confidence from Lockheed that Firefly can accomplish what they've set out to do. And this is great validation of that. Flight 7 validated some Block 2 upgrades, including improved avionics and thermal management, as well as proving out their ability to relight the second stage. So they launched Firefly out to 450 kilometer altitude to drop off Lockheed, and then they lowered down to a 200 kilometer altitude to relight their second stage to prove out that they're able to do that, which is a really cool technology. It helps with removing rocket bodies from orbit. So I like that they're trying to avoid adding to the orbital debris up there. And all of this is in preparation for the actual rollout of Block 2 on the next Flight 8, which will include some other improvements to the platform to help with manufacturability and reliability.
Yeah, it's good to see Firefly back in the saddle.
For a company that's been doing real well over the past months, Avio keeps coming up. They have been really focused on solid rocket production for missiles, although they also build rockets for their Vega C launcher, which has gotten a couple of contracts out of space companies to launch there, as well as the success of the Ariane 6-4 variant last month. So Avio's just been winning week over week across all their domains. They've changed up their kind of corporate structure recently because of their expansion to the U.S. They had announced a few weeks ago the construction of a $500 million production plant, and to kind of improve their ability to manage this new expanded corporate structure, they restructured their board to reduce the number of shareholder seats. So there was a lot of contention amongst their shareholders for this change, but ultimately it got pushed through. And I think it's what helped lead them to this week's news is that they were awarded a $65 million contract for the development of a solid rocket motor. This is for the US-based defense systems and solutions, and is to develop, qualify, and start the initial production of solid rocket motors. So this is building upon the success they've seen over the past year after Lockheed and Raytheon gave them funding to develop their technology for solid rocket motor production. They're still doing this production over in their headquarters in Italy, but they'll be expanding it over to their new headquarters or their new production facility in Hurt, Virginia, within the next couple of years to scale out production there as well.
Yeah, I can't imagine why the why the shareholders might be contentious about losing seats on the board, but the fact that they're already seeing benefit from the $500 million investment that they verbally committed to here stateside out in Virginia is really impressive.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see as to how much of that actual production line gets stood up in Virginia. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, but so far this is money that has not yet been spent, well spent.
Yeah, I mean, they like the stuff we talked about back in December with Avio was building out production in Italy, kind of in response to the demand for rockets in Ukraine. And now with the conflict in Iran, I can't imagine there being much benefit to moving some of this production over to the U.S. other than being closer to some of the traditional rocket manufacturers and their partners, Lockheed and Raytheon. So probably going to be a more even split than expected, but I'm guessing there's some tax advantage and just corporate advantage to having a production facility over in the U.S. as well.
Sure. I guess my point was more that the verbal commitment to investing $500 million in the state of Virginia, standing up the entirety of this production line, there's probably a lot of goodwill in that as well. You know, like that, they'd be able to stand that up for only $350 million, but they're over investing because they want to win contracts, because they want everybody in the U.S. to look kindly on them and to welcome them with open arms. And so not only have they not yet actually broken ground on anything, and not only have they not yet actually started to make investments, but because of the current geopolitical landscape, their products are in increased demand. So you're probably right that they will still look at standing up some capability, standing up some production in some facilities here in the U.S. I'm very skeptical that will actually amount to $500 million of total investment in the U.S., but there's very good reason for that, more so than just, we're going to promise a big check and then wind up walking away with $65 million in this contract and $50 million in that contract. Like, I don't get that impression, but I do think that, you know, the equilibrium that we'll wind up at is probably going to be less than $500 million in total investment here stateside.
On the in-space propulsion side of things, Propulsion has raised a $26 million round. This is to develop their field effect electric propulsion system. This is interesting news, as you know, we've noted several times that Hall effect thrusters have kind of been the default choice for a lot of satellite manufacturers. FEEP is not a new technology, but there aren't many players in this field. I find it interesting that Morpheus Space raised money very recently as well, which they're one of the few other players, and both of these are European producers. So there seems to be a real focus on that side of the pond to develop new technology for spacecraft. The FEEP electric propulsion system that they have is pretty impressive on the ISP front. It can reach up to 4,500 ISP, which is an order of magnitude above what Hall effect thrusters can do. So very efficient system, which is great for things like orbital maintenance. The thrust on it's relatively lower. They can scale it out by adding more units, but per unit, the max they can reach is 1.7 millinewtons of thrust. So not really great for high agility endeavors like we've seen with the agile space and ISP tech funding recently. So there's some demand for more agile thrusters for some of these space defense applications and just space responsiveness applications, but they're playing more in the kind of scaled out constellation maintenance kind of field of space.
On to the lightning rounds here. So for the business move side of things, the biggest one that I'm excited to talk about is Lux Eterna, who just closed a $10 million oversubscribed seed round led by some of their pre-seed investors with some follow-on investment, but also new investors, Convoy, Decisive Point, Qubit Capital, Wave Function, a couple others. But this investment is effectively an attempt to build up from the ground up satellites that have a clear and defined purpose for refurbishment, meaning they go up, they operate, they deorbit, they come back down, they get refurbished, and they get sent back up. Effectively, this is an impossibly meaningful step change in the price point for orbital assets. You can, with Lux Eterna's capabilities, you're now able to actually buy, lease, or own refurbished reused secondhand space assets. The big and quick comparison here is the US auto industry. The auto industry is actually driven by the secondhand market. It's actually driven by the used car market, not the new car market. New cars are incredibly capital intensive, and so you end up seeing, with a much lower barrier to entry, much less capital intensive assets with used cars. That's where actual inventory moves around. That's where the meat and potatoes, the bulk of the market actually is. And so there's a lot of simple and easy comparisons to make here. And this is something that's really exciting and really interesting to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I find it really cool because they're like, return vehicles are not new. Like, we had the space shuttle, and there is kind of a growing demand for reusability in the on-orbit manufacturing capability. We've seen it with Atmos recently, Varda with their launches. Inversion's got an interesting concept, but Lux Aeterna really is playing in like the true satellite application aspect of this. So being able to fly a satellite for whatever the mission is, return it, and then fly it for a different mission is a really interesting concept. As you pointed out, like, the reduction in cost for some of these players is a key enabler there in terms of a market fit. But I think also seeing that there is kind of this growth in technology that we're seeing booming as satellites become a more large scale investment could benefit from the capability of launching up new technology and then replacing it when an improvement is available, rather than flying a whole new fleet that becomes redundant.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said. One of the biggest barriers and one of the biggest hurdles for innovation in space is that a lot of the new ideas, a lot of the new pieces of technology, one of the things that we have to sort of pay a premium for is whether or not they will work retroactively, whether they'll be able to work with any of the assets that are already on orbit. And the sheer novelty of being able to not worry about that is a big game changer in and of itself. In other news, Diffraction has received another investment round as part of their pre-seed from SBI US Gateway Fund, along with the Plug and Play Tech Center Collaborative Fund, Wolf Point Capital, and Parallel VC. This pre-seed raise, which started in January with $4 million, has now ballooned to Diffraction being valued at over 100 million post. It's taken 2 months since they came out of stealth to go from $4 million in pre-seed funding to over $100 million post-money valuation. Just an absurd level of growth. Their quantum cameras, nobody has anything bad to say about their technology. Nobody has anything bad to say about their hardware. The quantum cameras are fabulous. They do everything they're supposed to do, 20 times better resolution, 1,000 times better and faster processing power. But this is just an absurd level of growth from a company that came out of the gates and is probably doesn't quite have its feet under it yet after figuratively catching the bull by the horn so effectively. In other news, Mantis Space has come out of stealth with a $10 million seed raise. This raise will enable Mantis Space to create their first demonstration payload and begin building their constellation of power satellites. Their business model involves providing power to satellites in Earth's shadow and beaming solar energy via laser terminal from their higher altitude assets to some of these lower altitude assets in need of additional power. It's part of a growing market. We've seen a couple of different players looking at effectively selling power and selling solar energy on orbit. This one is one of the newer ones and one of the more unique ones for a couple of different reasons, but I know that you were excited about this one as well.
Yeah, I really love space solar power as a growing market segment. I worked on a space solar project a couple of years ago, and at the time it was still a research project, but within 2 years, there's now 8 different companies that are playing in this space. They all have varying approaches. Like Reflect Orbital wants to use mirrors to reflect sun to Earth. There's some people like Vertus Solis, Overview Energy, that are doing similar, like gather with solar panels, beam it with infrared lasers. There's companies that are using microwave lasers. This one is interesting in that it's kind of a subsection of the space solar power industry. About 6 out of these 8 companies are all focused on beaming power down to Earth, but this is the only second one that's focused on beaming power from space to other space assets. So the main competitor they have is Starcatcher. who's been around a bit longer. They've had a great streak of sign-in customers within the past few months. And for Mantis to come out and raise this much money is another great point of validation for this kind of application. I think it's a really exciting application for space. The implications are like longer and better performance for spacecraft, and no need to retrofit things to fit into this architecture. And I find Mantis Space's approach a bit more straightforward. It's more in line with what most of the space solar power providers are doing. But it is an interesting deviation from Starcatcher. Starcatcher's design uses Fresnel lenses to focus solar power and mirror to then redirect it to their space targets, whereas Mantis Space is a lot more of the traditional design of gather and transfer it. It'll be interesting to see what the challenges are that they both face. I would imagine that Starcatcher has more troubles with pointing and geometry and orienting things, whereas Mantis Space might have more problems with efficiency of transferring from solar to electrical energy.
Right.
But I wish them both the best of luck, because I think this is a huge shift in how space can operate. I think it'll become really important when we start expanding to the moon. And there's been a lot of talk about the dark side of the moon and lunar nighttime. Trying to get power at those times are going to require technology like this. I think the sooner that we build this out, the more interest we have in this market, the better it is for all of space exploration.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the implications of having a reliable sort of space utility on orbit are just from the sort of F equals MA, the basic physics of it all, are pretty impressive. Just being able to allocate more of your mass, more of your volume, being able to not need to worry as much about the solar arrays or your own power generation, knowing that you can theoretically just buy additional power on the orbit once you're up there, means that you're going to be able to prioritize more for payload. You're going to be able to prioritize more for what you need to actually get done, rather than the support infrastructure to do that themselves. So there's a lot of potential sort of bigger vision and bigger implication, I'll say, like second order effects for the players like Starcatcher and Mantis Space establishing themselves and really helping to mature the orbital utility market. It should be fun to keep track of and continue to watch. Probably the biggest announcement that we have today is the acquisition of Orbion by York Space. This was a shot that we called back in January, shortly after York's IPO was announced, but
shortly before. We were even ahead of that.
We were ahead of the
IPO.
Oh man,
we're clairvoyant, man.
So this acquisition has been in active conversation between the two companies as early as Q4 of 2025. So as early as like October, November, they were talking since way back then. So this usually when companies start talking 6 months in advance of an acquisition, what winds up happening is both companies are very much aligned and on the same page about what success will look like post-merger and post-acquisition. So the fact that they started talking that early means that York did in fact execute their IPO so that they could make this purchase. And it means that both companies have known the intent and both companies have been aligned on this predating York's IPO. So I would not expect to see, there's going to be some bumps in the road. There's going to be some inefficiencies here, but I would be astounded if this acquisition wasn't a resounding success between the two companies, because they have been working on this together for so long. But the acquisition includes roughly 2.8 million shares of York Space Systems and an undisclosed cash amount. So the stock or the equity value that changed hands is valued at just about 61 million. Reporting has not yet disclosed what the total cash amount for the acquisition is, but usually these types of deals are some sort of 25% equity to 75% capital, or a sort of a 50-50 deal. That's usually one of the two sort of ratios that you'll see. So this could have involved as much as about 150 or 200 million, depending on how that breakdown is. But a very lucrative acquisition for Orbion. and a sure boon for York Space Systems, being able to shore up their supply chain, their key suppliers, and maintain sovereignty over their tech stack.
Yeah, I remember we called this back in January because York had just announced they bought 33 thrusters from Orbion for their PWSA Tranche 3 or Tranche 1. Yeah. And there was already rumors that they were going to go public, and Rocket Lab had just acquired, or Rocket Lab had been trying to acquire Mynaric, which was also, at the time recently revealed that was the optical communications provider for York Space. So kind of the dynamics that were playing out there led us to believe that like Orbion is going to be a target for acquisition if they're going to be involved in such a expansive project like PWSA. It's awesome that we called it, because I think electric propulsion acquisitions hadn't been that big recently. Like I think the last one was like Astra acquiring a space propulsion company a few years ago, and then Phase 4 sort of got acquired, but they just kind of went out of business and got broken up across like quantum space, and I forget the other one. So it hasn't been a common pattern, but again, with like the growing, the increase in constellations, the need for orbital control, and I would say increasingly with the need for space defense, like we're going to see this start popping up again. This is great for Orbion. They've been around for a while. A lot of great success. I think this will be a huge boon for York Space as they now try to expand beyond their tranche win. And the fact that they bought 33 thrusters was kind of a signal that there's going to be more satellites to come from them.
Yeah, congratulations to both teams. Really, this is definitely a win-win. Finally, from the business development side of things, Aspect Energy has acquired Kairos. Kairos is a Parisian satellite data and energy analytics provider being acquired by the London-based market and intelligence provider. It is an interesting example that runs a little bit counter to the traditional pattern that we see. Traditionally, we typically see space needing to sell to terrestrial, needing to go out and do the biz dev and to make those connections themselves as an industry. This is one of the examples of terrestrial industry coming and seeking space out and intentionally acquiring space capability. So it's a pattern that is likely going to increase and something that we will likely see happen moving forward, though the acquisition is still currently in review. It hasn't yet been approved. So it'll be interesting to see how the French and sort of European courts and stakeholders view non-space based acquirers and how they view that when it comes to regards for sovereignty, whether or not that's viewed as no different than an American or a London-based space company acquiring Kairos, or whether that's more of a neutral item in their regard. Like, well, it's there. Yes, technically this capability is leaving, but it's leaving for a terrestrial purpose, so it's exiting the space industry altogether.
Yeah, it's a trend we've kind of seen emerge slowly over the past years. I think we saw it mostly with companies like Digital Globe, now Vantor, Planet, Black Sky. Like they've shifted away from just being image providing companies to being insight providing companies. And I think the growth had been kind of slow because they had to acquire and build out the algorithms and technology in order to actually generate insights from their raw data. Yeah, and I think those insights are what prove really valuable to companies outside of the space industry, because they don't need a bunch of pictures. They need stuff that they can action upon for their particular application. So we talk a lot about like investment firms, insurance firms, like these terrestrial firms that can use satellite data to improve their financial capabilities. And I think in the case of the Aspect Energy, it's more likely like energy monitoring. So we've seen things like methane environmental monitoring have use cases for these data sets. But I think what's really accelerating is the advent of AI and the way in which it's kind of affected everything is giving more people more abilities to generate kind of applications on top of these platforms that satellite providers have built out. So, in prior years, it's been companies like Vantor developing their own algorithms and then selling the output. We've seen a lot of those kind of contracts come from Black Sky recently. But I think what we would see more happen more frequently in the coming months, years, is that third-party companies can build applications on top of these platforms to provide very targeted insights to particular industries outside of the space industry. And I love to see that because it provides the opportunity to generate value to more players in the space industry, but it also expands Earth imaging to markets outside of the space industry, which is what we really need in order for that kind of application to expand. Kind of like we've seen it to communications as it matured further. It was no longer like a space market. It's a ground telecommunications market that now has space aspects integrated into it. On the tech advance side of things, cool news, starting off with Perpetual Atomics signing a memorandum of understanding with Blue Origin to collaborate on space missions and space applications enabled by radioisotope power technologies. So RTGs are not new. They've existed on some orbiters like Voyager, going out, beyond where the sun can really reach them at any meaningful amount without huge solar rays, as well as on some rovers on the moon and Mars. These use radioactive isotopes in order to generate heat, which you can use to generate electricity, and that's how we power the vehicles out there. They've been pretty rare because only really NASA and government agencies are allowed to use them due to the complexities of handling nuclear material. And there's been some resurgence in this capability as we talk more about going to the moon and going to Mars and going further out into space. This technology is becoming more critical. And so the restrictions on it are being revisited, and we're starting to see more companies stood up to kind of meet that need. Perpetual Atomics has shown up recently, back in December, with a partnership with Orano. So they were a technology spun out of the University of Leicester. It uses Americium-241 for the RTG. This is an interesting approach to it, as in the past, a lot of the RTGs that NASA's launched use plutonium, which, there's relatively similar benefits between the two. But the nice thing about Americium is that it's a waste product from terrestrial nuclear power plants. So it's not like we have to refine their own components for it. I think that scales a bit better if we're talking about large scale interplanetary habitation. So this is a great sign. A stalwart player like Blue Origin backing a smaller company like Perpetual Atomics to build out this capability, I think will be a huge benefit to their Blue Moon lander and their other lunar aspirations, but also a kind of burst through the door effort for the space industry in general to kind of push this back into an acceptable form of power generation.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think of almost the corporate strategy on Blue Origin's side of things, that they are intentionally sort of prioritizing and looking for non-traditional, non-solar based power solutions. So I would expect with this to see some growth in investment and advancement in their lunar capabilities and what they're trying to accomplish on the moon. And it's sort of indicative. It sort of amounts to them putting a little bit of money where their mouth is, as far as some of the stated priorities we've seen towards lunar habitats, lunar civilization, lunar infrastructure, et cetera.
Also on the moon is Astrobotic, with a new partnership with the Italian Space Agency and NASA to build out wheels for the multi-purpose habitation vehicle. This is sort of deviation for Astrobotic, as they've been focused on landers. They had their Peregrine lander launched back in 2024, which unfortunately failed due to a fuel leak and returned to Earth. But they have the Griffin lander going up this year. So definitely keeping an eye on their lunar lander efforts, but this is great to see that they're also working on lunar rovers through this partnership. They've been in existence for 12, 16 years, somewhere in that range. And so they've worked on a lot of technology. They have developed a technology for lunar wheels. It's this sort of tension spoke system that allows them to be flexible for the terrain, to adapt to the terrain of the moon. And clearly the European Space Agency, the Italian Space Agency, see some value in this. So they've granted some award to Astrobotic. I think this is a great expansion of their core focus. They're focused on lunar habitation. We've seen a lot of work done to lunar rovers as well as lunar landers recently. Artemis 3 transitioned their focus away from human landing to lunar rover landing. So I think there's going to be an increase in demand for these kind of capabilities, and this positions Astrobotic well to capitalize upon that. NASA has awarded Redwire another $4 million contract to advance drug development on the International Space Station. This is part of a $25 million IDIQ that they've been using to fund these operations. This is the 43rd operation for Redwire using their Pillbox platform. The Pillbox is a unit that can be deployed to the ISS that was developed under the Maiden Space Company that was acquired by Redwire several years ago. The heritage behind this is great. Like that's quite a few operations. I know we talked with Space Phoenix back in January, and they were saying there's hundreds of operations planned for the ISS. So, this is a small portion of that, but it has shown actual value by delivering new drug formulations for companies outside of the space industry, which is, again, a trend we love to see, including Apera and Bristol Myers. I know that ritonavir is one of the recent ones that BARDA had developed. There's other drugs that these companies are developing on this platform. What I really hope to see is continued use of this, especially as the ISS is looking to get expanded out to 2032. But hopefully this technology can also benefit other space manufacturing providers like BARDA, like Space Phoenix, when they go to kind of operationalize this at a larger scale on dedicated satellites for producing these at larger production volumes. Lastly, for today, we have Another Earth raising $4 million to boost their AI training with synthetic satellite data. This company uses generative AI, to create satellite data that can then be used to train for detecting environmental and operational risks. So this is kind of playing the trend of digital twins, which has had a boost recently amongst multiple factors, just like satellite modeling, testing, monitoring of fleets. So having this capability is certainly useful for development of new capabilities. It's a lot easier to use synthetic data than to try to get all your own, especially if you haven't launched anything yet. So like to see this technology as it helps smaller space companies kind of get stood up, develop out their own capabilities, and give them more flexibility to try out different things. It should also lead to better safety on orbit, to make sure that if you're doing a certain operation, it's not dangerous. You can integrate that with data that is generated in orbit, like that Stargaze generates. So having this kind of capability will be great moving forward as space continues to get more crowded with more players. That's a wrap for this week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Harrison Lambert and Paul Mayer signing off for now.